Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it waits for the perfect moment to walk back into the room. The late summer sun was melting into the rolling hills of Napa Valley, turning the vineyard wedding venue into a painting of gold and amber light as rows of white chairs stretched across the manicured lawn and a string quartet played softly near the rose-covered arch where the ceremony would soon begin. And Daniel Brooks stepped out of a polished black sedan, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had already won every chapter of his life. Beside him stood his fiancée, Sophie Langford, radiant in a pale champagne dress that shimmered whenever the breeze lifted the fabric. Her hand looped through his arm as they walked toward the crowd of well-dressed guests gathering beneath the glowing string lights. The air filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the sweet scent of fresh flowers drifting from the reception tent. Daniel recognized nearly every face in the crowd: old college friends, former co-workers, people who had watched his life unfold over the past decade, and he welcomed their greetings with a relaxed smile that never quite left his face as congratulations and compliments flowed easily around him. Because tonight he felt exactly the way he had hoped he would after his divorce 2 years earlier: successful, admired, and finally free from the quiet life he had once believed was holding him back. Someone handed him a glass of sparkling champagne, and another friend clapped him on the shoulder, joking about how quickly he had upgraded, and Sophie laughed softly beside him while Daniel shrugged with a modest smile that hid a flicker of pride in his eyes. The vineyard stretched endlessly behind the ceremony space, rows of grapevines running nearly half a mile toward the low California hills, glowing in the last light of the evening sun. And as Daniel took a slow sip from his glass, he noticed a few guests glancing toward him with curious expressions, the kind of look that meant a familiar name had just surfaced in conversation. It didn't take long before someone finally asked it, casually, almost as if it were a harmless piece of gossip drifting through the warm evening air. "Hey Daniel, have you heard if Emily might be here tonight?" For the briefest moment, the question hung there like a small ripple in the otherwise effortless evening. But Daniel simply chuckled under his breath and shook his head, the name stirring a memory he hadn't thought about much in months. Emily Carter, his ex-wife, the quiet woman who used to stand beside him at events like this with a polite smile and a soft voice. The woman he once believed would never fit into the ambitious world he was building. Sophie tilted her head slightly with mild curiosity as Daniel answered. His tone relaxed, almost amused. "Emily? I doubt it. Weddings like this were never really her scene." A few guests laughed lightly, the conversation drifting quickly back to safer topics as the music continued playing and waiters began passing trays of appetizers across the lawn, and Daniel slipped his arm comfortably around Sophie's waist, convinced the past had already faded far enough away to never surprise him again. But down the gravel driveway that curved through the vineyard entrance, just beyond the glowing lanterns and the distant hum of conversation, a sleek black car was slowly rolling toward the ceremony gates, and inside that car sat Emily Carter, calm, composed, and no longer the woman Daniel thought he knew. The black sedan rolled slowly along the curved gravel driveway that cut through the vineyard like a pale ribbon beneath the fading California sunset, its headlights gliding across the rows of grapevines that stretched nearly half a mile across the quiet hills. And inside the car, Emily Carter sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, while the distant sound of violin music drifted through the open window, faint but unmistakable. 2 years earlier, the thought of returning to a place like this would have tightened her chest with the weight of old memories. But tonight her breathing was steady and her posture relaxed, the reflection in the window showing a woman who had quietly rebuilt herself piece by piece in the silence after everything had fallen apart. The sapphire blue gown she wore caught the golden light from the horizon, its silk fabric simple but elegant, chosen not to impress anyone, but because it reminded her that she no longer had to shrink herself to make someone else comfortable. And as the car approached the entrance gate, the driver slowed to a gentle stop while a valet stepped forward to open the door. Warm evening air flowed inside, carrying the scent of roses and fresh grass from the ceremony lawn, and Emily stepped out onto the gravel path with a calm grace that felt natural now, the soft heels of her shoes pressing lightly against the stones as she lifted her gaze toward the vineyard where the wedding guests were beginning to gather. Laughter and conversation floated through the twilight, glasses clinking somewhere beneath the reception tent. And for a brief moment, the entire scene looked exactly the way she remembered events like this from years ago when she used to stand quietly beside Daniel while he charmed every person in the room. But tonight she was not standing beside Daniel Brooks, and the difference between those two realities felt almost surreal. A tall man stepped out from the other side of the car, adjusting the sleeve of a perfectly tailored charcoal suit before walking around the vehicle toward her. His presence calm and grounded, the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to raise his voice to command a room. Alexander Hayes glanced toward the glowing vineyard entrance, and then back at Emily with a warm smile that softened the sharp lines of his face. His voice low and reassuring as he asked if she was ready, and Emily nodded with a small breath that carried neither fear nor hesitation. Alexander offered his arm, a simple gesture that had once felt intimidating when she first met him nearly a year earlier at a charity art fundraiser in San Francisco, where their conversation had stretched late into the evening as they spoke about design, architecture, and the strange pressure of rebuilding a life after the past had unexpectedly collapsed. Back then she had known his name from business magazines and technology headlines. The founder of a company that had grown into one of the most influential software platforms in the country. A billionaire whose schedule was often measured in private flights and board meetings, yet none of that had mattered the night they met, because Alexander had listened to her ideas about art and community projects with the same thoughtful attention he gave to global investors. Now, as they began walking toward the vineyard entrance together, the soft gravel crunching beneath their steps, the golden lanterns lighting the pathway one by one as evening settled across the valley, Emily felt something she had not felt in a very long time when returning to a place connected to her past. Not dread, not anger, but a quiet certainty that she was no longer the woman Daniel had once believed she would always remain. The lanterns along the vineyard pathway flickered softly as Emily and Alexander approached the ceremony lawn, their warm lights stretching across the gravel like quiet invitations into a world that had once belonged to another version of her life. Ahead of them the sound of laughter and music grew clearer, the gentle notes of the violin drifting across the evening air while guests gathered beneath white floral arches and rows of wooden chairs that faced the rolling Napa Valley hills glowing in the final light of sunset. Inside the reception area, Daniel Brooks lifted his champagne glass while speaking with a group of old friends, his voice relaxed, confident, the way it always became when he was surrounded by familiar admiration, and Sophie Langford stood beside him with an elegant smile, her eyes scanning the crowd with quiet satisfaction as waiters moved between guests carrying trays of sparkling drinks and small plates of appetizers. For Daniel, the evening felt effortless, a celebration not only of the wedding but of the life he believed he had carefully rebuilt after the divorce. And he leaned slightly closer to one of his friends who had just made another joking comment about his past, shrugging with a grin that carried just enough charm to make the story sound harmless. But across the lawn a subtle shift began to ripple through the gathering crowd, a quiet turning of heads that moved like a wave through the rows of guests near the entrance as conversations slowed and curious glances followed the same direction. Daniel noticed it at first only as a small change in the rhythm of the room, a pause in laughter, the faint sound of someone whispering a familiar name that brushed past his attention before he fully processed it. Emily. The name drifted again, softer this time, carried between two guests standing near the lantern-lit walkway, and Daniel turned slightly, his eyes moving toward the entrance just as the crowd parted enough for him to see the figures approaching from the gravel path. Emily Carter walked beside Alexander Hayes with calm composure, the deep sapphire color of her dress catching the glow of the evening lights as she stepped onto the ceremony lawn with a quiet confidence that felt entirely different from the woman Daniel remembered from their past. For a brief moment his mind refused to connect the image in front of him with the memory he had carried for 2 years, because the Emily he remembered had always stood half a step behind him at events like this, her presence gentle and supportive but never commanding the room itself. Now she moved through the crowd with effortless grace, Alexander beside her greeting a familiar guest with a polite handshake as murmurs began to ripple more openly through the gathering. Someone near the front of the ceremony space whispered Alexander Hayes with unmistakable recognition, the name passing quickly from one guest to another as the realization spread that one of the most influential technology founders in the country had just arrived at the wedding. Daniel felt the glass in his hand grow suddenly still as he watched the host of the event step forward with visible surprise and a welcoming smile, extending his hand toward Alexander before turning warmly toward Emily. And the words that followed carried clearly across the soft evening air, as if the vineyard itself had fallen briefly silent to hear them. Alexander Hayes and his wife, Emily Hayes, welcome. We are honored you could join us tonight. The sentence landed quietly, but with the weight of something undeniable, and Daniel Brooks stood frozen for a heartbeat as the truth settled into the room around him. The woman he once believed would always remain in the background of his story had just walked back into his world as someone entirely new. For several seconds after the host spoke those words, the evening seemed to pause in a quiet ripple of surprise, the golden lights above the vineyard swaying gently in the breeze, while conversations across the lawn slowed into curious whispers. Emily Hayes. The name lingered in the air with a subtle weight that many of the guests instantly understood, because Alexander Hayes was not simply another visitor arriving late to a wedding reception. He was a name that appeared on financial news, technology panels, and philanthropic foundations across the country. Several people near the front of the ceremony lawn straightened slightly, their expressions shifting from polite interest to unmistakable recognition as Alexander greeted the host with an easy smile, his handshake warm and confident, the kind of presence that came from a life spent in rooms where decisions carried global consequences. Beside him, Emily stood with the same quiet composure she had carried through the entrance, acknowledging the host with a gracious nod as the violin quartet continued playing softly beneath the archway, the music returning the vineyard to its natural rhythm after that brief moment of surprise. Daniel Brooks felt the sound of the strings echo strangely in his ears as he watched the scene unfold from across the reception lawn, the champagne glass still resting in his hand while his thoughts struggled to rearrange themselves around the reality he had just heard. Emily Hayes. The name repeated quietly in his mind as though his memory was attempting to rewrite something that had already happened. Sophie Langford noticed the shift in his expression before he even spoke, her eyes following his gaze toward the entrance where guests were now greeting Alexander with increasing enthusiasm, and she leaned slightly closer with a small crease of curiosity forming between her brows as she asked if that woman was the same Emily he had mentioned earlier. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but the words came slower than he expected because the woman he was looking at no longer matched the image that had lived in his memory for 2 years. The Emily he remembered had often chosen simple dresses for events like this, standing politely beside him while he carried conversations across the room. But the woman walking across the vineyard lawn now moved with a calm assurance that quietly commanded attention without asking for it. The sapphire silk of her dress caught the lantern light as she greeted a couple standing near the aisle, her smile warm yet composed. And Daniel realized that several of the guests who had once barely acknowledged her were now stepping forward with obvious interest, eager to introduce themselves to Alexander Hayes and the woman beside him. Sophie followed the direction of those glances, her voice softer now as she asked how long it had been since Daniel had spoken to Emily, and he answered automatically that it had been nearly 2 years since the divorce papers were finalized. The words felt distant as soon as they left his mouth because the timeline suddenly seemed far shorter than it should have been. For a transformation like this to take place, across the lawn, the ceremony coordinator guided Emily and Alexander toward a group of seats reserved near the front, explaining that the couple had helped sponsor part of the charitable foundation connected to the wedding. And Emily listened attentively while Alexander thanked the coordinator with a modest smile that seemed completely natural to him despite the attention gathering around them. Daniel watched as Emily took her seat beside Alexander. Beneath the warm glow of the vineyard lights, the quiet confidence in her posture unmistakable, and for the first time that evening a thought crossed his mind that he had never once considered since the divorce, that perhaps the woman he believed he had outgrown had simply grown beyond the world he once offered her. The ceremony began beneath the rose-covered arch as the final light of the Napa Valley sunset faded into a deep amber glow across the vineyard, and the gentle sound of the violin quartet carried over the quiet rows of guests who now sat facing the aisle, while a warm breeze moved softly through the grapevines stretching nearly half a mile toward the distant hills. Daniel Brooks lowered himself slowly into his seat beside Sophie Langford, but his attention remained fixed on the front row where Emily and Alexander Hayes now sat together with calm composure, the lantern light above them casting a soft golden halo across the polished wood chairs reserved for close friends and honored guests. For years Daniel had attended weddings like this with effortless confidence, the kind of social setting where his voice carried easily through conversation and people gathered naturally around him. Yet tonight the rhythm felt different, as though the center of gravity inside the vineyard had quietly shifted somewhere beyond his reach. Sophie leaned slightly closer to him as the officiant began welcoming everyone to the ceremony, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked again how Emily had met Alexander Hayes, because she recognized the name now just as many others had. A technology founder whose company had transformed digital security systems across the country and whose philanthropic projects had funded education programs in cities from San Francisco to Boston, Daniel answered slowly that he had no idea how Emily could possibly know someone like that. And even as he spoke the words, he realized how strange they sounded. Because the Emily he remembered had once spent weekends sketching designs for community art spaces and quietly volunteering at small charity events, while he focused on building the ambitious corporate career he believed would eventually carry them both forward. Across the aisle, Emily listened attentively as the bride walked down the aisle between rows of glowing lanterns, her posture relaxed and graceful, the same thoughtful attention in her eyes that had once appeared whenever she studied architecture sketches or discussed the possibilities of transforming old spaces into places where people could gather and create something meaningful together. Alexander sat beside her with the quiet steadiness that had become so familiar to her during the past year, occasionally leaning slightly closer to exchange a soft comment while the ceremony unfolded, and several guests seated nearby cast subtle glances toward them with growing curiosity, the recognition of Alexander Hayes continuing to ripple quietly through the gathering like a conversation that had not yet found its voice. Daniel noticed those glances as well. The way people who had once greeted him with easy admiration were now shifting their attention toward the front row, and he felt an unfamiliar tension settle in his chest as he realized that the evening he had expected to unfold so smoothly was slowly revealing a different story than the one he had imagined. Sophie followed his gaze again and asked if he had ever truly understood what Emily wanted out of life when they were married, and Daniel paused longer this time before answering because the question stirred a memory he had not revisited in a long while. Evenings when Emily had spoken quietly about creating spaces where art and community could meet, ideas that had once sounded impractical to him, while he was focused on promotion schedules, quarterly targets, and the next step in his career ladder. The officiant's voice rose gently as the couple exchanged their vows beneath the arch, the words echoing across the vineyard while twilight settled fully over the hills, and Daniel watched Emily sitting calmly beside Alexander Hayes in the lantern light, realizing with a quiet unease that the life he believed he had moved beyond might have been quietly growing into something far greater than he had ever taken the time to see. The ceremony ended beneath the soft glow of vineyard lanterns as the newly married couple walked back down the aisle to warm applause, and the gentle music of the string quartet slowly shifted into a brighter melody that signaled the beginning of the evening reception. Guests rose from their seats and drifted toward the reception lawn where long wooden tables were arranged beneath strands of golden lights that stretched across the open space like constellations hanging above the valley, and waiters began moving through the crowd offering glasses of sparkling wine while the distant hills faded into deep blue twilight beyond the rows of grapevines. Daniel Brooks stood slowly beside Sophie Langford as people around them began to talk more openly again. Yet his eyes continued to drift toward the front of the ceremony space where Emily and Alexander Hayes had just stood to greet the bride and groom, their conversation easy and relaxed as the newly married couple thanked them warmly for attending. Daniel noticed the way the groom's father shook Alexander's hand with obvious respect, speaking with a familiarity that suggested more than a simple social connection. and several nearby guests leaned closer to hear pieces of the conversation that mentioned a charitable foundation and a technology initiative supporting community learning centers across several states. Sophie followed Daniel's gaze again, and this time she spoke more thoughtfully, asking if Emily had always been involved in charity work like that, because the way people were greeting her now suggested someone who had built a reputation of her own. Daniel hesitated before answering, remembering fragments of conversations from years ago when Emily had talked about combining art spaces with education programs for neighborhoods that lacked access to creative resources, ideas that he had once dismissed as admirable but unrealistic, while he focused on corporate goals that felt far more practical at the time. Across the reception lawn, Emily listened as the bride laughed and thanked her again for helping connect the foundation with one of Alexander's community initiatives earlier in the year, and Alexander stood beside her with quiet pride in his expression as though the project meant just as much to him as it did to her. Daniel felt something tighten subtly in his chest as the realization formed more clearly that the transformation he was witnessing was not simply about wealth or influence, because Emily's presence carried something deeper than that, a calm sense of purpose that seemed to draw people toward her conversation rather than away from it. The reception music grew livelier as guests began finding their seats at the long tables where candles flickered inside glass lanterns, and Daniel noticed that several of the guests who had spent the earlier part of the evening talking with him were now making their way toward Emily and Alexander instead, eager to introduce themselves or exchange a few words. Sophie touched his arm gently and asked if he planned to speak with Emily later in the evening, and Daniel answered automatically that it might be polite to say hello. Yet even as he spoke, he felt uncertain about what that conversation might look like now that the past and present had collided so unexpectedly. Across the lawn, Emily and Alexander began walking slowly toward the reception tables as the evening deepened into a warm California night, and Daniel Brooks watched them from a distance with a growing awareness that the quiet woman he once believed he understood had returned not to revisit the past but to reveal a future he had never imagined. The reception tables filled slowly beneath the canopy of warm string lights as the night settled gently over the Napa Valley vineyard, the air carrying the faint scent of lavender and freshly cut grass, while soft music drifted across the lawn from a small jazz trio that had replaced the string quartet. Glasses clinked lightly and quiet laughter rolled across the gathering as guests found their seats along the long wooden tables decorated with white roses and glowing candles inside clear glass lanterns. Daniel Brooks remained standing for a moment longer beside his chair, watching as Emily and Alexander Hayes approached the main reception area, where several guests were already rising to greet them with genuine enthusiasm. The shift in attention was impossible to ignore now, not dramatic or loud, but steady and unmistakable, like the slow turning of a tide that gradually reshaped the shoreline. Sophie Langford noticed it as well, her eyes following the small cluster of people forming around Emily while a well-dressed couple introduced themselves to Alexander with visible admiration, mentioning a conference in Silicon Valley and a technology summit that had taken place earlier in the year. Daniel finally sat down, but his gaze remained fixed on the scene across the lawn, where Emily was now speaking with the bride's parents, her voice calm and thoughtful while she listened carefully to something the bride's mother was explaining about a scholarship program connected to the foundation Emily had helped support. The lantern light reflected softly in her hair as she nodded and smiled, and Daniel suddenly remembered evenings from years ago when Emily used to speak with the same quiet intensity about creating spaces where art and education could meet, ideas that had seemed distant from the structured path he believed success required. Sophie leaned slightly toward him and spoke with a tone that carried both curiosity and surprise, saying that Emily seemed very different from the way Daniel had once described her, not shy or uncertain, but completely comfortable in a room filled with people who clearly respected her. Daniel gave a small nod, though he realized the gesture felt incomplete because the difference Sophie was noticing was not simply confidence, but something deeper that had grown quietly in Emily during the time they had spent apart. Across the reception lawn, a waiter offered Alexander and Emily glasses of sparkling water as the bride and groom joined them for a moment of conversation, thanking them again for helping introduce the charitable project that would provide new digital learning labs for several schools in the region. The groom laughed lightly and said that the partnership had already attracted attention from donors who wanted to expand the program nationwide, and Emily listened with thoughtful focus before responding that the real goal was to create places where students could explore creativity and technology together, because communities grew stronger when people were given the chance to imagine something better for their future. Daniel heard fragments of that conversation carried across the lawn by the gentle breeze. And with each word he felt the distance between his memory of Emily and the woman standing beneath the lantern lights widen into something he could no longer easily explain. Sophie rested her hand lightly against his arm and asked if he was all right, and Daniel answered quietly that he was simply realizing how much could change in 2 years. Across the vineyard reception, Emily Hayes stood beside Alexander as the evening continued to unfold around them, speaking with warmth and quiet authority. And Daniel Brooks watched from his seat with the growing understanding that the life he once believed he had moved beyond had not disappeared at all, but had quietly become something far greater than he had ever allowed himself to see. The evening reception settled into a warm rhythm beneath the glowing string lights as dinner plates were served across the long vineyard tables, the quiet hum of conversation blending with soft jazz drifting through the cool California night, while candles flickered gently in the glass lanterns placed between arrangements of white roses. Daniel Brooks sat with Sophie Langford at the center table, where several of his former colleagues were discussing business and travel plans. Yet the conversation felt strangely distant to him, as though he were listening from somewhere outside the moment itself. Every few seconds his attention returned to the table near the front where Emily and Alexander Hayes were seated with the bride and groom. Their conversation relaxed and thoughtful while guests continued to approach them with polite introductions. One of the groom's business partners leaned across the table toward Alexander with visible excitement, mentioning a recent interview about his company's expansion into educational technology platforms, and Alexander responded with an easy smile while gently redirecting the conversation toward Emily's work with community art and digital learning programs. Emily listened quietly for a moment before explaining how the idea had started during a small neighborhood project that helped convert unused buildings into creative classrooms where students could explore both design and coding. And as she spoke, several guests leaned closer with genuine interest, asking questions about how the initiative might expand to other cities. Daniel watched this unfold with a growing sense of disbelief because the woman he once believed had been content living in the quiet background of his ambitious plans was now speaking with a calm authority that filled the entire table with attention. Sophie noticed the shift in his expression again and asked gently whether he had known Emily was working on projects like this, and Daniel answered honestly that he had not realized how far those ideas had grown. Across the lawn, the bride raised a glass in a small toast, thanking everyone for attending the celebration and acknowledging the support of friends who had helped bring meaningful projects into their community. And she mentioned Emily by name while describing the learning initiative that would soon open in several local schools. A warm ripple of applause moved across the reception tables as Emily smiled modestly, clearly more comfortable discussing the impact of the work than the recognition itself. Daniel felt the sound of that applause echo in his chest in a way he could not easily explain because it revealed something he had overlooked during the years they were married, that Emily's quiet focus had never meant a lack of ambition, only a different kind of vision than the one he had been chasing. Sophie studied Emily for another moment, and then said softly that she seemed like someone who had always known exactly what she wanted to build, even if other people had not noticed it at the time. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes still following Emily as she laughed gently at something Alexander said, the two of them sharing a brief glance that carried an ease and partnership Daniel could recognize even from across the lawn. The music grew slightly louder as the band transitioned into a livelier tune, and several guests began walking toward the open dance floor, yet Daniel remained seated, watching the quiet confidence with which Emily Hayes moved through the evening. And for the first time since the reception began, he understood that the past he once believed he had left behind was not returning to challenge him at all. It was simply revealing a story that had continued to grow long after he stopped paying attention. The music from the small band drifted gently across the vineyard lawn as more guests gathered near the dance floor. the rhythm of the evening growing warmer and more relaxed beneath the golden glow of the string lights stretched above the reception tables. Waiters moved quietly between the guests refilling glasses, while laughter rolled softly through the night air. Yet Daniel Brooks felt an unusual stillness inside his chest as he watched Emily Hayes rise from her seat beside Alexander. She had been speaking with the bride's parents when another group approached their table, a pair of older guests who greeted Alexander with immediate recognition and spoke enthusiastically about a recent foundation announcement that had appeared in several national publications earlier that week. Daniel could not hear every word from across the lawn, but fragments of the conversation reached him through the open space between tables. Mentions of a national partnership, educational innovation grants, and the expansion of a creative technology initiative that would soon launch in several states. The older man laughed warmly and said that the idea had already attracted attention from major investors because it connected two things that rarely met in traditional education: creativity and digital engineering. And he gestured respectfully toward Emily while explaining that the entire concept had originated from one of her early community projects nearly 3 years earlier. Daniel felt the words settle into the evening like a quiet revelation, because 3 years earlier had been the final year of their marriage, a time when he remembered Emily spending long evenings sketching renovation plans and writing proposals for small art spaces she hoped might become learning centers for young students. At the time, he had believed those plans were thoughtful but impractical dreams, the kind of ideas that could never compete with the fast-moving world of corporate growth he was pursuing. Now the same idea was being discussed beneath the vineyard lights as a national initiative supported by one of the most influential technology entrepreneurs in the country. Sophie Langford leaned slightly closer to him again and asked if he realized Emily had been involved in something so significant even before they separated, and Daniel answered honestly that he had not understood what she was building at the time. Across the reception lawn, the older guests shook Emily's hand warmly, thanking her for creating a program that had already begun transforming several struggling school districts, and Emily responded with a modest smile while explaining that the real credit belonged to the educators and volunteers who had helped turn the early sketches into working community spaces. Alexander stood beside her with quiet admiration in his expression, listening as she described the project with calm clarity rather than pride. Daniel watched the exchange carefully and understood something that had never been clear to him during their marriage: that Emily's quiet determination had never been uncertainty, but focus, a different kind of ambition that did not need applause to keep moving forward. Sophie glanced at him again and spoke softly, saying that sometimes the most powerful ideas grow quietly while everyone else is looking somewhere else. Daniel did not answer right away because he was beginning to realize that the woman he once believed had been standing still in his shadow had in fact been walking steadily toward a future that now stretched far beyond anything he had imagined for either of them. The music from the dance floor swelled gently into a lively rhythm as more guests stepped onto the polished wooden platform beneath the strings of golden lights, laughter rising into the warm Napa Valley night, while waiters moved gracefully through the reception carrying trays of desserts and fresh glasses of sparkling water. Daniel Brooks remained seated for a moment longer, watching the movement across the lawn where Emily Hayes and Alexander were now standing near the edge of the dance floor speaking with several guests who had gathered around them with quiet enthusiasm. A woman from one of the local school boards was thanking Emily for visiting their district earlier that spring and describing how the new creative technology lab had already changed the way students approached learning. And Emily listened attentively, her expression warm but grounded, explaining that the goal had always been simple: to give young people the tools to imagine something larger than the limits they believed were placed around them. Daniel heard those words carried faintly across the lawn and felt an unexpected memory surface from years earlier, when Emily had once said something very similar during a conversation late one evening in their small apartment, a time when he had nodded politely but dismissed the idea as idealistic. Sophie Langford rose from her chair and gently touched his arm, suggesting that they should walk over and congratulate the newly married couple before the evening grew later, and Daniel stood slowly beside her, aware that doing so would also bring him closer to the front of the reception where Emily was standing. As they crossed the lawn, the sound of music and conversation blended together beneath the glowing lights, and Daniel noticed again how easily people gravitated toward Emily's conversation. The same quiet focus that had once made her an attentive listener, now drawing people toward her words with genuine respect. When he and Sophie finally reached the group surrounding the bride and groom, the newly married couple greeted them warmly and thanked them for coming. And Daniel offered his congratulations with the same polite confidence he had always carried into social gatherings. Yet as the brief exchange ended, his eyes lifted instinctively toward Emily, who was standing only a few feet away beside Alexander, speaking with the school board representative. For the first time since she arrived, their eyes met directly across the small space between them. The moment was brief but unmistakable, and Emily's expression held no tension, only a calm recognition of someone who had once been an important part of her past. Daniel felt the quiet weight of that glance settle into his thoughts as Emily finished her conversation and turned slightly toward him. Alexander noticed the shift as well and gave a courteous nod in greeting, his demeanor open and respectful. Daniel returned the gesture automatically, aware that this simple moment of recognition carried far more meaning than any dramatic confrontation could have. Sophie greeted Emily politely and commented on how beautiful the evening had turned out, and Emily responded with the same warmth she had offered everyone else that night, her voice calm and gracious. The exchange lasted only a few seconds before another guest approached to ask Alexander about the education initiative again, and the conversation naturally shifted away. Daniel stepped back beside Sophie as the music continued playing, and couples began moving across the dance floor. Yet the brief meeting lingered in his thoughts because the calm dignity Emily carried now revealed something that had taken him years to understand. That the quiet woman he once believed he had outgrown had never needed to compete with his world at all. She had simply continued building one of her own. The music softened slightly as the band transitioned into a slower melody, and the dance floor filled with couples moving beneath the soft glow of the vineyard lights, their silhouettes drifting gently across the polished wood while the night air carried the faint scent of grapes and summer grass across the reception lawn. Daniel Brooks stood near the edge of the tables beside Sophie Langford, watching the quiet movement of the evening as conversations flowed easily around them, yet his attention continued returning to the same place across the lawn where Emily Hayes and Alexander were now standing with the bride and groom near the dance floor. The newly married couple had just invited several guests to join them for the first group dance, and laughter rippled across the gathering as people stepped forward with raised glasses and warm applause. Emily smiled as the bride reached for her hand and encouraged her to join the circle forming on the dance floor, and Alexander laughed lightly beside her before offering a playful bow that made several nearby guests smile. Daniel watched the moment unfold with an unexpected sense of stillness inside his thoughts because the scene carried a quiet familiarity he recognized from years earlier. Emily had always been the kind of person who made others feel comfortable without needing attention for herself. Yet tonight the difference was clear in the way people naturally gathered around her presence rather than overlooking it. Sophie noticed his distant expression again and asked softly if seeing Emily had brought back difficult memories. And Daniel shook his head slowly before answering that the memories were not difficult so much as surprising. Across the dance floor, Emily stepped lightly into the circle of guests, her sapphire dress catching the lantern light as the music carried a soft rhythm through the vineyard night, and Alexander joined beside her with an easy smile, while the bride clapped her hands in encouragement. The moment felt warm and effortless, the kind of simple joy that weddings were meant to celebrate. Yet Daniel could not ignore the quiet realization forming within him as he watched from a few yards away. During their marriage, he had often believed that Emily's calm nature meant she was content with a smaller life, that her ambitions were gentle ideas rather than serious pursuits. Now he understood that her quiet determination had simply followed a path that did not need to compete for attention in crowded rooms. Sophie folded her arms lightly and studied the dance floor with thoughtful curiosity before saying that Emily seemed genuinely happy, not because of the attention she was receiving, but because of the work she was doing. Daniel nodded again, his gaze still following Emily and Alexander as they moved with the music among the guests. The glow of the lanterns reflected softly across the vineyard hills while laughter drifted across the lawn, And in that peaceful moment, Daniel Brooks recognized something that had remained invisible to him for years, that the strength he had once mistaken for quietness had always been the foundation of the life Emily was now living. The music continued beneath the golden lights while the celebration carried on around them, and Daniel stood watching the woman he once knew with the growing understanding that some stories do not return to challenge the past at all. They simply reveal how far someone has traveled while the rest of the world was looking somewhere else. The music slowed again as the band shifted into a softer melody, and the night deepened over the Napa Valley hills, the vineyard glowing beneath strands of warm golden lights, while a gentle breeze moved through the rows of grapevines that stretched quietly beyond the reception lawn. Couples continued to drift across the dance floor in slow circles, while others returned to the long wooden tables where candles flickered inside glass lanterns and the soft murmur of conversation carried through the evening air. Daniel Brooks stepped away from the edge of the dance floor and walked slowly toward the far side of the reception lawn where the lights grew a little quieter and the sounds of laughter faded into the background. He paused near the vineyard fence where the valley opened into a wide stretch of darkened hills, the sky above scattered with distant stars. For a moment he stood there in silence, letting the cool night air settle around him while the events of the evening replayed slowly in his mind. Behind him, the music continued and guests applauded as the bride and groom finished another dance. Yet Daniel felt removed from the center of the celebration in a way that was not uncomfortable but reflective. Footsteps approached softly across the grass, and he turned slightly to see Emily Hayes walking toward the same quiet corner of the lawn, her sapphire dress moving gently with the breeze as she stepped away from the crowd for a moment of fresh air. When she noticed him, she paused briefly and then continued forward with the same calm composure she had carried all evening. The lantern light from the reception area reached just far enough to illuminate their faces as they stood a few feet apart near the vineyard fence. For a second neither of them spoke, not out of tension, but because the moment carried the quiet weight of two lives that had once been closely connected and had since grown in entirely different directions. Daniel finally offered a small, respectful smile and said that it was good to see her again, his voice steady but thoughtful. Emily returned the smile warmly and answered that it was good to see him as well and that she hoped life had been treating him kindly. The conversation felt simple and genuine, free from the awkwardness Daniel had once expected when imagining a meeting like this. He admitted quietly that he had not realized how much her work had grown since they last spoke, mentioning the learning centers he had heard guests discussing earlier in the evening. Emily leaned lightly against the wooden fence and explained that the projects had started small, but had slowly gained support from teachers and community leaders who believe creativity and technology could open new paths for students. She spoke with the same calm focus Daniel remembered from years ago, but now the ideas carried the momentum of something fully realized. Daniel nodded slowly and said that he could see that she had built something meaningful, something that had clearly changed lives. Emily looked toward the reception lawn where Alexander was speaking with a group of guests near the dance floor and said softly that the work had grown because many people believed in the vision, including Alexander, who had helped connect the project with resources she never imagined possible. Daniel followed her gaze for a moment before speaking again with quiet honesty, telling her that he was glad she had continued pursuing the ideas she once talked about even when he had not fully understood them at the time. Emily listened with gentle understanding and replied that life had a way of revealing things when people were ready to see them. The music from the reception floated softly across the vineyard as they stood together beneath the quiet night sky. Two people who had once shared a different chapter of the same story, now meeting again with a calm respect that needed no explanations. The vineyard night had grown quieter as the celebration continued beneath the warm canopy of lights, the music drifting gently across the lawn while laughter rose and faded like waves along the edges of the gathering. Daniel Brooks and Emily Hayes remained for a moment near the wooden fence where the valley opened into dark rolling hills beneath the clear California sky, and the distant glow from the reception cast a soft golden outline around them. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the fence rail and looked out across the rows of grapevines that stretched nearly half a mile into the quiet distance, taking a slow breath before speaking again with a thoughtful honesty that had not come easily to him in the past. He said that seeing everything she had built tonight had made him realize something he had never fully understood before, that the dreams she once spoke about had not been small ideas at all, but the early sketches of something meaningful that only needed time and belief to grow. Emily listened without interruption, her expression calm and kind as the breeze lifted a strand of hair gently across her shoulder. When he finished, she gave a small thoughtful nod and said that sometimes people simply grow in different directions and that it does not mean anyone failed. It only means life carried them toward the places they were meant to go. Daniel looked at her then with a quiet respect that replaced the old assumptions he once carried, and he said that he was genuinely glad she had continued forward even when he had not seen the path clearly at the time. Emily smiled softly and replied that the important thing was that everyone eventually finds the life that allows them to become the person they are meant to be. Behind them, the music from the reception rose slightly as the band began another lively tune, and a burst of applause drifted across the vineyard lawn. Alexander Hayes appeared a few moments later, walking toward them with his relaxed confidence, having noticed Emily stepping away from the crowd earlier. He greeted Daniel politely with a warm nod and asked Emily if she would like to return to the celebration because the bride and groom were inviting everyone to join the final dance of the evening. Emily glanced once more toward the quiet hills beyond the vineyard and then back toward the lights where the celebration continued, and she thanked Daniel for the conversation with the same grace she had carried throughout the night. Daniel returned the gesture with a respectful smile, understanding that the moment did not require anything more. Emily then walked beside Alexander back toward the music and laughter where guests were gathering beneath the golden lights, their figures gradually blending into the warm energy of the celebration. Daniel remained by the fence for a few seconds longer, watching the vineyard stretch peacefully beneath the stars before finally turning back toward the reception where Sophie was waiting for him near the dance floor. As he walked across the lawn, the music grew clearer again, and the lantern lights shimmered across the evening air, and Daniel Brooks understood something with a quiet certainty that had taken years to reach, that the story he once believed had ended with a divorce had in truth continued far beyond him, not as revenge or regret, but as the quiet triumph of a woman who simply kept becoming the person she was always meant to be.